Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'm your host, the Social Solipsist, and this week, against my will, I was coerced into watching Death on the Nile from 2022. Now, after my previous viewings and discussion of various other Agatha Christie adaptations and the previous against my will review of the other Kenneth Branagh adaptation from 2017, yeah, here we are. Now, I had it on reasonably good authority that this movie was better than the Murder on the Orient Express adaptation, and I wavered back and forth, but I am pretty sure it is worse. Which is saying a lot because that movie was awful. This movie takes pretty much every problem that movie had and makes it worse, doubles down on it, or extrapolates in some way, or just drops some new horrible things in it. It is not the worst movie I've ever watched by any means, but as an Agatha Christie adaptation, it's terrible. As a Poirot adaptation or a Poirot mystery of any kind, it's terrible. As a mystery, it's pretty terrible. As an adventure action film, it's pretty terrible. I cannot tell you what this movie does well. But I can tell you what it attempts to do well. So, obviously, if you haven't watched the other movie or the other video I made about the Murder on the Orient Express adaptation, I highly recommend you go watch that, as well as my Death on the Nile 1978 review. I recommend you go check that out, because I'm going to refer to both of them here with some context. This movie's ugly. It wants to believe that it is a glorious, beautiful thing, and it is just ugly. As I mentioned in the Murder on the Orient Express video, that film uses extensive amounts of CGI for reasons I cannot understand, and it does it badly. It's cheap, it's ugly, it's lumpy and lit weird and all kinds of things. And this movie does that more often and worse. Now, if you watched the 1978, Death on the Nile review, you'll note that I mentioned how there's I think 40 minutes of the film at least that has almost no content in it. It's really just set pieces and really showing off that they actually went to Egypt and shot this stuff there, either in Egypt or other places where they're actually outdoors in spaces. This movie shirks all of that and decides to do all of the sweeping shots of Egypt in CGI, and they look awful. It's unbelievable how bad they look. I was going to talk about a shot near the beginning of the film, and then I realized I need to back up even further. But let me talk about that shot first. So near the beginning of the film, there's an establishing shot of Poirot examining one of the Great Pyramids at Giza, and then a scene that follows near and on it, on the pyramid, which is very similar to the other adaptation that I watched. However, it is some of the shittiest green screening I have seen in a long time. It looks, I could do better. If you gave me a couple of hours, I'm pretty sure I could fix this footage without even having the raws, just because they just didn't even bother to like cut and blur edges when they were doing the rotoscoping or the green screening or any additional cleanup passes. Just doesn't seem to be there. And that, in addition to all of the lighting problems that make it look extremely unreal, where all of these light sources, as with the previous film, are being cast on characters in a CGI space, but nobody bothered to like think about where the light was coming from. And so you've got light casts on faces, especially, that make no sense to the setting that they are, where they're standing, or any such thing, or even the color of the lighting isn't right, which is something you could easily fix, well, sloppily, but easily fix in post with some color grading effects. Didn't bother. Didn't bother at all. And that extends throughout the film. A bizarre number of set pieces that could have been practical for relatively little money are just sinfully ugly. And that doesn't even get to the sweeping shot, overhead shots that of like cameras sweeping over these set pieces, whether it's a pyramid or a temple or a tomb or whatever, where you already know it's fake because no real world camera. Well, if you didn't already know it's fake from how ugly it is, no real world camera could move at the rate and speed that it does. So it's just this like these sweeping overhead shots with very unnatural movements that you know can't be real. And then they're ugly, as I said. They are rendered in only barely better than the quality of like a National Geographic or History Channel like CGI infographic from the late 90s or early 2000s. That's the kind of rendering we're talking about here. And they've put a bunch of layers of lighting on top of it to make it like, to try and pretty it up. But lighting can't fix like basic model and layout problems. It just doesn't. It's completely absurd and it's completely ugly. Now, let me step back to the thing I remembered that I need to talk about, which is the very beginning of the movie. And this gets into an overarching problem of, as with the previous film, adding content that didn't need to be there. And while the 2017 adaptation of Murder on the Orient Express added a bunch of stuff just to add it, just to like give some extra whatever, this movie lost the plot, quite literally. The death on the Nile is relatively minor and has been lost behind what should be a subplot but appears to be the main plot. And that starts at the very first scene of the movie, which I'm going to do some amount of spoilers here. I don't think I'm not going to spoil the mystery, so I'm just going to like spoil certain scenes. So don't worry about me spoiling the mystery itself. Not that if you care about the mystery itself, don't watch this film anyway. But I digress. The beginning of this film is shot in black and white because that's the kind of hack that Kenneth Branagh is, to make sure you know that it's a flashback to being an older time. And it's footage of troops in the trenches in World War I. And then what we quickly discover, very unsubtly, is a young Poirot in the trenches. And the scene, the scene is, it's hackneyed at best. This whole sequence is, oh look, he was always smart, and had like clever ideas, and people just want to trust him. But then you hear at the end of the scene, you hear the first nail in the coffin of this film, which is a bomb going off and Poirot taking shrapnel from the bomb. And in a subsequent scene, you see that his face has been scarred by the shrapnel. Now, initially, on first watching, this appears to be a really cheesy, shitty excuse for why Poirot's mustache in this series is so fucking absurd. And I mentioned it in the other review, that Branagh's Poirot has the stupidest mustache I've ever seen in my life. Weirdly, it's actually toned down in this film. It is a bit smaller, a bit less bushy, a bit less flowy, a bit less absurd for, what an actual human being generally can grow out of their face. However, it is used as a plot point that he grows the mustache to hide the scars on his face, which is not a thing that was ever true of Agatha Christie's Poirot. And in addition, kicks off the plot line that will ruin the film, which is that Poirot just wants to be in love. Yes, you heard that right. Poirot wants to be in love. And the whole movie turns into this shit show of diverging and crossing plot lines about the meaning of what real love is, and appreciating people for their flaws and not worrying about the conflicts that try and come between love. And none of this is relevant to the fucking story. It's completely meaningless. It is completely useless. It is laughably badly presented. It is against Poirot's character to care about, for other people's sake generally, let alone his own, any specific affections. Part of Poirot's finesse as an investigator is that he's able to be a distant observer of other people's behavior. And so you have this through line about love and everybody just needing love, and it ruins the film. And I'll talk more about it as it comes up, because it will continue to be a problem through a variety of different ways throughout the film. So let me jump back a little bit to the setting and the production value. The enormous amount of CG is already absurd, and the movie overall is ugly in its cinematography, in its editing, etc. But the boat itself is a massive problem in the same way, and yet some different ones, that the train is a problem in Branagh's adaptation of Murder on the Orient Express, because this boat is obscenely huge. It is a pleasure yacht of a scale that would not exist at the time. It ruins the plot, because a key point of the Death on the Nile story is about how the size of the boat and the shape of it and the way the rooms are oriented is key to how the crimes are committed and the events unfold, because people need to move around the boat without seeing each other or with seeing each other, or these other key plot items. And that completely falls apart because they've made this enormous boat for the spectacle of it. Now, as far as I know, this is obviously some of these spaces must be real, like They can't be. They weren't standing on fake staircases. But I'm sure this thing is a set. The CGI stuff on the exterior of the boat, I have to assume maybe they have like a set on a barge for some of the exterior shots, but some of it is definitely CGI. A substantial amount of it, I should say. But there's also no reason to have these spaces other than for the spectacle, and so that you can have the right space, the big air quotes around right space, to set a particular scene, or any given scene that Branagh has imagined exists in a particular space. Basically, the way I imagine this worked is Branagh read the script, looked at each of the scenes that was supposed to play out, imagined in his mind how the room that would what the room that would play out looked like, and then gave them a list of rooms that had to exist on this boat in order for him to get his visual metaphor the way he wanted it. And so what you have is this like 3-story yacht, pleasure barge thing that just makes no sense, is ugly, and proceeds to ruin the plot. Because the plot, as I said, is keyed in on the space that they're working in. And because they've ruined the structure of the boat, as a result, they just have to tell you that things happened the way they did. Because I'm willing to bet there's no single blueprint that you can assemble of all of the rooms and shots on this boat that it would be like a non-Euclidean mess, because the spaces have to be stretched and shortened in order for the chases, which again, we're back to having chase scenes in this movie for some reason, need to happen over a certain amount of space. People need to move for a certain amount of time. And so they just, when things are happening, they tell you that they tell you, instead of showing you, that things were a certain distance away, or that it took people a certain amount of time to cross such a space, or to have enough time for an event to happen. And obviously, that's a disaster, because you're telling instead of showing in a mystery film. I don't know how to get across better than that. That if you are telling people what happened in a mystery film, especially one with, as with many Agatha Christie things, that have inconsistent inconsistent stories, where you're trying to reconcile the stories of different people who may be lying or telling some version of the truth, or only what they know of the truth, that trying to reconcile that requires both an understanding of time and space and the events that transpire, and whether or not those things could be truthful. And with a nebulous space like this, you can't. So it just tells you what's happening and expects you to enjoy the experience of being told that a mystery is happening. Oh boy, I've still got a ways more to go with this one. None of this is helped because of the truly awful acting present throughout most of the film. It is not universally bad, but it's pretty bad. Now, I've talked about before that I don't particularly like Gal Gadot. I think she's pretty untalented. Despite appreciating some movies she's been in, like, she's not a good actor. Plain and simple. She attempts an accent, an appropriate accent in a few scenes of this film, and then for the rest of them, she just has her whatever Israeli accent. And it doesn't make any sense. It's distracting from the rest of the film. in addition to just her generally questionable acting chops. Her ability to impart any given particular emotion to a scene is questionable at best. The rest of the cast varies. Some are okay, mostly by virtue of not having very much time on screen, and others are pretty bad. I will say I don't have a very high opinion of Russell Brand, and when I saw him first on screen, I'm like, really? You cast Russell Brand for this? He pulls off his character okay. It's better than I expected from him. It's still not very good though. The actual castings themselves are mostly okay. And I'm only saying that because there's a bunch of changes made to characters that from the original story in name or presence or relevance to the story. And in addition, some brand new characters that have been added for reasons that I will get to later. And so for most of the roles as they seem to have been intended, I'm okay with the ideas of the castings at least. However, as with the previous one, they are working with a very iffy script most of the time. As I noted, a haphazard plot line that jumps all over the place, not only because it has been hacked apart by the lack of a proper setting to work with, but also in order to shoehorn in a bunch of other plot threads that don't need to exist and don't exist in the original. And then there are the invented characters who... So there are two characters in particular who are added and not just adapted at all. They're completely brand new, who are notably black because in the context of the film, it's the 1930s. They are somewhat successful. They are friends with a bunch of wealthy white people, and it is a plot line in talking about their fighting for some amount of success in the context of, an era when even in, Europe, even in continental Europe, but especially in the United States, they were not very welcome to be successful. And the two characters themselves are actually not bad. It's Sophie Okonedo and Letitia Wright, who are both talented actors in their own right. But the only reason they exist in this film, as far as I can tell, is for two reasons. One is to make this point that about that I don't think anybody was confused about or wanted to argue about, the struggle of people of color and basically any non-white person in most of the world in the 1930s. And obviously there's some amount of like, did you just shoehorn this in so you could say, oh, we're aware of what Hollywood is like and we're trying not to cast an all white movie. You could go either way on that. It's nice to see some diverse casting, but it's maybe not the time and place. The other part of their reason for existing is so that there can be two separate plot lines about this love issue, about how love is important and love sees past the boundaries that we set in other ways. And this gets both into race and class, and culminates in a scene that is completely unneeded, in which Poirot is defending the the younger woman whose name I'm forgetting, who played by Letitia Wright, um, and saying, "Oh, despite what you see, she's despite the color of her skin, she's better than the person she's going after," so on and so forth. And then also showing his own, like, he throughout the film, but up to that point, and especially at that point, he also has a crush. Poirot has a crush in this movie on Sophie Okonedo, and it's just I didn't think I didn't think I was in store for them to gut Poirot even more than they did, gut Poirot's character even more than they did in the previous adaptation. But here we are. Poirot's got a crush, and it makes him fall apart at the seams and stutter and not be able to talk properly, and not be able to do his job. And it all loops back to the beginning of the movie and his wounding and this the woman that he had in his life at the time, and all this other shit that just doesn't need to be there. It's extraneous. It is stretching out a film that's already too long, and distracts greatly from the actual mystery at hand. So while actually I would probably say that Sophie Okonedo and Letitia Wright's characters are probably some of the most fleshed out in the movie and have some of the better acting of anyone on the cast list, they are completely extraneous. And I'm a little bothered by their inclusion at all. There are a couple of other notable names on this list, but the one elephant in the room that has to be discussed very shortly is Armie Hammer, who has at this point been basically blacklisted by Hollywood. I never thought he was a particularly capable actor in the first place, but was since I am going to have to talk about this, was accused of some rather extensive sexual misconduct and expressing some, let's say, tendencies of moral question. He was accused of wanting to participate in cannibalism. That's neither here nor there. The guy's weird. He's not good in this film. We're just gonna move on. Anyway, yeah. So the acting is pretty bad. The sets are pretty bad. The script is bad. What else can we talk about? The music and sound is like, it wavers. Some of it is nice. I actually quite like that it feels more like an excuse than an intentional choice, but because Sophie Okonedo is acting as this blues singer, or some such thing, like they add a bunch of sort of contemporary American music from that time in a place where it normally would not have been appropriate. Obviously, European Nile River excursion would not be the place where you'd normally hear that music, but it's nice to hear. Aside from that, most of the sound editing is pretty bad. It is definitely too loud and too quiet at various times. Mixing in a couple of cases was so bad that I could not hear the dialogue over certain things. And of course, it overuses certain musical cues to add tension where there needn't be any. And they do add a lot of various scenes of tension. Boy, I've almost skimmed over that fact that there's a bunch more, there's a lot more gun fights / brandishing of guns and chases and like high tension scenes and I'm pretty sure, more deaths in this version than there are in the original. It's just a mess all around. The costuming is actually pretty decent. A couple, well, it varies, actually, I should say. Some of the costumes are excellent and some of them are terrible. None of them are very good in terms of being appropriate for the time. The fashions of the 2020s are on display here. And it does mean that the characters actually look good in the clothes that they're wearing. But beyond that, it's definitely got quite a bit of anachronism in it. And ultimately, I could just keep nitpicking this movie. I could point out more specific things that are wrong with it. That I could just like do a live viewing where I watch it and just do a dub over it, like a riff tracks, because there's so much shit to talk about this movie because it's just very bad. But it ultimately does not come off as much of a mystery. Definitely not a Poirot. Definitely not an Agatha Christie. It really has no redeeming qualities whatsoever. And for all of the complaints that I made about the 1978 adaptation of The Death on the Nile, it is a vastly better adaptation, despite its many flaws. Please stop giving Kenneth Branagh things to do. He's apparently making yet another Agatha Christie adaptation, another Poirot adaptation in the coming years, which I both am and am not surprised at. These movies are relatively cheap to make. Not as cheap as they appear to be, because they're so fucking ugly. This one was alleged budget of $90 million. So not that cheap, but not big blockbuster either. And I guess they're making enough money to warrant continuing to make them. But please stop. Please let somebody else try and revive this genre. I mean, for fuck's sake, I was trying to look something up about the film right before recording this and ended up seeing one of the trailers because auto-playing video on websites. I hate auto-playing video on websites. Anyway, and it auto-played the trailer and I saw it, and it's the trailer was framed like a horror movie, like a horror thriller. And whatever tone this movie does or doesn't have, it's not a horror thriller. At best, you might call it a tragedy romance. But that'd be really pressing it. Anyway, I'll stop meandering about with this one. It's real bad. No surprise there. You knew that in the first couple of minutes of this video. Don't watch it. Thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I've been the Social Solipsist, and I'll be back for something I actually wanted to watch. Hopefully. God, hopefully. Next time.